Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining the Conservation Fund today. We recognize everyone's time is extremely limited, and we're really appreciative of the fact that you, as representatives from partners and funders, as well as individual conservation enthusiasts, chose to spend part of your day with us. My name is Lucas Bladen, and I'm a member of the fund's development team, where I help spread awareness of the importance of conservation. I keep our supporters updated on our progress, and I get to host fun conversations like this one. And we would not be here and having this conversation today without supporters like you. So before we go any further, I just want to thank you all for all the ways that you support the fund. A couple of housekeeping notes. We will be recording today's session to share with some folks who weren't able to join us today. So that's why you may have received a message about the recording when you joined. And then in terms of the flow, I have got a couple opening remarks to get us started. But we'll spend most of our time with our three incredible panelists you see on screen. And we'll have about 15 minutes of open questions and conversation before we let everyone go. So as you all know, we're gathered here in observance of Earth Day, which was founded over 50 years ago, back in 1970, in response to the rampant pollution and environmental degradation that characterized a lot of American landscapes and cities in the mid 20th century. I'm sure many of you have seen things like images of Ohio's Cuyahoga River on fire, and in southern New England, where I'm from, we still struggle with air quality, but this was a really rampant public health concern at the time. The first Earth Day was actually branded as an environmental teach-in, so I think it's really fitting, actually, that we're honoring this tradition with an educational panel and dialogue here. Earth Day's had a really monumental impact on the public's understanding of the importance of a healthy environment, and it's directly inspired so many safeguards for clean air and water and conservation as a whole. It's fitting also that the Conservation Fund then sprang onto the scene in 1985 with a unique charter that's dedicated to both environmental conservation and economic development. In the 39 years that have followed, we've worked to conserve nearly 9 million acres of special places, and that comes out to over 600 acres of land protected every single day. That's land that otherwise would have been lost to development, but is now able to support biodiversity, keep communities resilient in the face of climate change, protect clean air and water, and promote sustainable jobs and outdoor recreation. When we read stories about the health of our planet, it's often framed as these big, complex challenges like clean energy and green infrastructure and changes to industrial processes, and all of that is incredibly important in its own right. But those problems can sometimes seem far removed from our daily lives, or maybe too big to tackle on our own. But when it comes to land and land conservation, the reality is every day we're interacting with land where we live, where we work, recreate, and play. It's the most personal connection that we all have to our environment. It is literally our Earth. And so on a personal level, protecting land is critical to our well-being. And from a climate standpoint, land conservation promotes some natural climate solutions that add another critical layer of protection. That can mean things like helping trees more effectively sequester carbon and offset greenhouse gas emissions, allowing wetlands to filter water and buffer against flooding, and promoting sustainable agricultural practices, to name just a few examples. Forests, for example, are terrific engines in combating climate change and sustaining local communities. And through our Working Forest Fund, which we'll talk more about later as well, we've stored over 254 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is equivalent to the yearly emissions of over 60 million gas-powered passenger vehicles. It's a really incredible number. These forest ecosystems we've protected also safeguard over 2,400 miles of streams and 150,000 acres of wetlands, supporting clean water for communities all over the country. Outcomes like this are only possible through the partnership of folks like you, and so we really thank you for being a part of our journey. Today, we're going to be talking about a handful of projects that have especially pronounced benefits for the health of our planet and the species that call it home. And I'm excited to introduce the conservationists who took these projects to fruition. So Clint, Heather, and Dan, could you just please quickly introduce yourselves? And if you have a particular memory of Earth Day you'd like to share or favorite way you like to spend time outside, I know we would love to hear that too.
Thanks, Lucas. This is Clint Miller. I'm the Central Midwest Regional Director of the Conservation Fund. I'm based in Rochester, Minnesota. And I'm going to admonish Lucas a little bit because celebrating Earth Day, I get to present a project that we did in Wisconsin. Gaylord Nelson is considered the father of Earth Day, and he was a senator in Wisconsin when he proposed the forming of Earth Day. So I will note that that's where I'm coming from. I grew up in Wisconsin. All the activities that I will talk about related to our Pelican River Forest are all the things I like to do outdoors. Trail running, mountain biking, hunting, fishing. All of those things are exciting to me. So thanks. I appreciate the opportunity today.
Thanks, Lucas. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Richards. I'm the Mid-Atlantic Regional Director and the Virginia State Director, and I am coming to you today from beautiful Culpeper, Virginia, in the Piedmont of Virginia. And I guess, if I had to pick one thing that I would be doing on Earth Day, it'd be hiking in my friendly neighborhood park, which is Shenandoah National Park, just right in my backyard practically. So that's where I love to hike. The Appalachians are home for me. I've grown up on the East Coast and kind of grew up hiking everywhere from Virginia all the way up through the White Mountains and New Hampshire. So, this is where I'm passionate about protecting and have lived in Virginia for most of my adult life. Although I originally grew up right outside the Delaware Water Gap in New Jersey, northwestern New Jersey, and that was kind of where we'd go on the weekends. So, Dan, I'll hand it over to you.
Heather, I didn't realize you also grew up in New Jersey. That's interesting. I just learned that. I'm Dan Schlager. I'm the Wyoming State Director for the fund, and I am based in Denver, Colorado. I've been working land conservation around the Northern Rockies for 30 years, moved west around 30 years ago from the East Coast. And I have a random funny Earth Day memory. When my son was 13, my wife and daughter were off visiting colleges, and we had planned a camping trip. And so we had a little pop-up camper, and we were going to hike some slot canyons in Goblin Valley in Utah, which is sort of incredibly beautiful. And we had just gotten a new kitten the week before, and I was a dog person, grew up with dogs, but this was new, kitten was new, and so we said, well, there was no one home to take care of the kittens, so we said, why don't we take them with us camping in this camper? So now the wind is blowing in Utah, and we're worried the kitty's going to get cold, and we have a little heater in there, and we have it on full blast, and then as we go to sleep each night at the end of the camper, we kind of had him secured in this little area near the heater underneath the table with some blankets, like kind of keeping him in there. Turn off the light. 60 seconds later, my son's like, Dad, there's the kitty on top of his head, like in the bed. And so we put him back in there. We try to secure it more. 60 seconds, turn off the light. Dad, kitty's back there. We could not figure out, we still don't know how he was getting out. We'd wait to see if he could, how he was escaping from under this table. But anyway, we finally gave up, and he, roamed around keeping us up all night. And we worked through our heating propane tank in about 18 hours, keeping him warm. But it's a really funny memory that we think about a lot. And that was on an Earth Day weekend, 10 years ago, I think it's now 8 years ago now.
That's great. It's an Earth Day mystery.
Yep.
Well, awesome. We're going to be hearing plenty more from each of you. We're excited. And after presentations, like I said, there will be plenty of time for conversation with our full group. But with that, Clint, I will pass it off to you first to tell us more about Pelican River Forest.
Thanks, Lucas. I appreciate it. Okay, so I think, is it Jolie or Lucas running the slides?
It's me, so you can admonish me
thank you.
at any point.
No, I won't admonish you anymore. Thanks, Lucas. I appreciate it. Thanks to Dan and Heather as my co-presenters. I appreciate it. Again, a reminder, my name is Clint Miller. I am the Central Midwest Regional Director. I've been with the Conservation Fund for 16 years, and I've been working in the Midwest that entire time doing our project-based work, which that means, just like Dan and Heather, we're the ones who are out there doing the acquisitions, the land protection work, working with our partners to do that. Next slide, 2, please. And what I will note, with the exception of this particular slide, all the slides or all the photos that you're going to see are of our Pelican River Forest project in northern Wisconsin. One of the things that I want to talk to you about too is really about the forest of these forest land threats. And as Lucas referenced earlier, our Working Forest Fund is tackling some of these. And what I want to lay out for you is the threat itself. So big forest lands, and this is an example of a forest land that's been carved up. The danger that we see is that they're parcelized. Multiple pathways to that fragmentation can occur. It can be in the form of construction of homes. It could be significant roads, highways, transmission lines, even the forest management itself. And when this conversion happens, or this fragmentation happens, at some point you'll get some sort of perhaps permanent land conversion. Or what I fear more than, say, a house being built is the parcelization, the division, the legal division of these properties into smaller and smaller pieces. Because one of the things I always say, it's very hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. You know, we can often fix a lot of things or deal with poor management. Even houses disappear over time. But when you legally divide land, that can change the landscape for generations. And it really does affect the recreation, the forestry, the forest economy, the biodiversity, and even water quality in a region. So we're losing like 37 million acres of forest land in the coming decades. To tackle that, in the next slide, Lucas, please. To combat this rapid conversion of forest land, the Conservation Fund has tasked a portion of our team to work and they've created a unique strategy. It's called our Working Forest Fund. That Working Forest Fund generally sets out to use a variety of techniques. And generally, well, I'll describe it as acquiring land, managing that land, conserving that land, and then reselling that land. So one of the things that stands out that we stand out from the rest of the conservation groups is we are not long-term holders of land. We don't have a series of preserves that we own and manage. So we're looking at, in this case, acquiring that land. We manage it or set it up for sustainable forestry, and then do the conservation, whether that's selling it to a public entity like a national forest or a state forest or local government, or if it's selling a conservation easement, which is a legal document that restricts certain uses. And then at the end, we may resell that land, especially if it's under a conservation easement. This is a capital intensive process. It means we need to spend millions of dollars up front to acquire these big properties. We own and manage those lands for a while. It takes an enormous amount of capital for us to do that. Capital that we usually borrow. So there's a couple of really important things to think about when we're talking about our Working Forest Fund strategy. Number one is that low cost capital, getting a hold of low money that doesn't cost us much. Just like when you're buying your house, if any of you are homeowners, you sure want that mortgage rate to be really low. That's absolutely critical to your ability to own the home. The second thing that's super important to us is a pathway to funding the long-term conservation, which is usually reliant on a government program. So the Conservation Fund, again, stands out amongst its peers because we're experts in the business of conservation. We look at these projects, we assess we carefully evaluate the risks of acquiring land, securing that low-cost capital, and then guiding our government partners, who are usually who we're working with on these projects, down a path of securing funding to permanently protect the land. Then once our project is secure, we can exit and we can move on to the next project. So Lucas, if you could pop to the next slide. And as Lucas noted earlier, we've been very successful at doing this. We've got over 1 million acres of secured since launching the Working Forest Fund. He noted the amount of climate benefits that we've had with 259 million metric tons of equivalent carbon stored. We've protected almost 2,500 miles of streams, rivers, and over 150,000 acres of wetlands. That's enormous. For those of you who don't think in acres, that's an enormous area that we've been able to protect. And equally as important, we think about the economic benefits and the economic returns. So, for example, with our working forest, we've had an impact on over an $861 million economic impact and secured over 7,500 jobs in the forest industry sector. So let's pop on to the next slide, if you would, please, Lucas. So one of our largest projects with the program is the Pelican River Forest. The Pelican River Forest on the map is shown in the kind of the colors in the middle, the ones that are a little bit off green and then a sort of tan color. They're northeastern Wisconsin, an area that is dependent on the forest economy, the forest products industry, as well as the recreation economy. And what you'll see, this property is like the bridge between two really important public land segments. The first is up to the upper right-hand side of the slide. That's the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, and then down to the southwest part of, or the left-hand corner of the slide, lower corner of the slide, is the county forests. We acquired this property. This property is 70,000 acres. So for those of you, again, don't think in acreage, this is like the entire corner of a county. We own about an eighth of the county itself. It was a former industrial timberland, one that's uniquely intact. It's connected. Oftentimes these timberlands that we're looking at are significantly fragmented. One of the things that I'll note on this here is that we bought this property a couple of years ago. Over that period of time, we've been trying to secure conservation easements through the Wisconsin's forest legacy programs. These are permanent legal restrictions that allow forestry. They require recreation. They limit the ability for us to subdivide the property into multiple parcels. They provide permanent public access. So what they're doing is they're protecting the conservation values of that property, and they're enforceable by the Wisconsin DNR, so that they can't, Department of Natural Resources, the Wisconsin DNR. That way we can't, or the next owner cannot violate those terms. Well, as I noted, this project is this bridge between the public land. It spans the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes watersheds. It provides critical drinking water to nearly 40,000 people downstream, including 2 tribes, and has multiple rare species within its boundaries, including the American marten, neotropical migratory birds, and uniquely wolves, timber wolves. In fact, I just got a request this morning from the Wisconsin DNR to do some work with timber wolves, which is really exciting. Lucas, you could flip to the next slide. There's more than 70 miles of interior roads that will be open. Important to these communities up here, the snowmobile and ATV and UTV trails, which will be complemented by big roadless sections for other folks to access. And again, as I stressed, the public access in this area is really important. Our ongoing logging operations support more than 630 jobs in the forest products industry. And in our portfolio of more than 300,000 acres, we hold this property stands out for its climate resiliency, storing over 90 million metric tons of carbon. Lucas, you could flip to the next slide, please. And while we still own this land, we're celebrating its permanent protection with the easements that we've secured. It's important to know that we're going to be managing this for a number of years. And the bulk of the conservation funding for this project came from the Federal Forest Legacy Fund program, which is a grant to our partners at the Wisconsin DNR. But what I want to stress here is that philanthropy played a really critical role. First, that low-cost capital from program-related investments with loans from foundations helped us to acquire that land. Secondly, when those government funds fell short during the acquisition of the conservation easements, we had individual donors, several foundations step up to the table, including one foundation that provided a key challenge grant, which was really important to our ability to raise funds in that gap. we're working towards the next step on the Pelican River Forest. We're excited about opportunities within that Wisconsin area, and then also the Great Lakes. There's a lot of other opportunities for projects to fit in with our Working Forest Fund program. So, Lucas, if you'd flip to the next slide, I will wrap up my presentation. I appreciate everybody's the opportunity to present and talk to everybody. I'm happy to answer questions as we get towards the questions at the very end. And at this point, I'll send it over to Heather to talk to us about another cool project.
Great. And I will just say, there'll be plenty of time to ask your question directly at the end, but if there's something you'd like to make sure we get to, feel free to use the chat at any point. But thanks a lot, Clint, and Heather, I'll pass to you.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Clint. So we're going to move from the upper Midwest to the mountains of Southwest Virginia and talk a little bit about a project that we're right in the smack in the middle of with the Buffalo Mountain Natural Area Preserve and Future State Park. This project started for me, although it's been going on for about 30 years before me. It started for me with a call from the then director of the Department of Conservation and Recreation here in Virginia in early 2021. Clyde called me and he said, "Hey, we have this opportunity. Can you help?" And I want to tell this story a little bit from the perspective of how do these projects come to us and what's our role in making these kinds of projects happen. It's a question I get a lot, which is, well, how exactly does the fund work? How do these projects come to you? So let me start with a little bit of history and a little bit of centering us on where we are. Floyd County is a part of Southwest Virginia. It's an hour from the city of Roanoke and also about an hour from the city of Blacksburg, where Virginia Tech is based. So it's within within driving distance of pretty significant population centers. But when you drive into Floyd County, it's like driving back a century in time. It's known for its very vibrant music scene. Floyd Fest is a huge music festival there, but you can go into the town of Floyd on any given night and hear live bluegrass pretty much every day of the week. And it's also known for its Blue Ridge Parkway access and the really stunning views. This picture actually is a picture of Buffalo Mountain in the distance from a significant overlook on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what Floyd County doesn't have is a lot of public land. For all that it has a pretty significant stretch on the Blue Ridge Parkway, much of the property is private and the opportunities for outdoor recreation are pretty limited. So Buffalo Mountain Natural Area Preserve was actually originally founded in 1993. It was purchased from the Lawson family and had been part originally of a large land grant given to Henry Lighthorse Lee after the Revolutionary War as a reward for his service. He also was the 9th governor of Virginia, and his small one-room log cabin law office is still actually on the property we're going to be talking about today. And this project will significantly add to the protection of sensitive species and communities in the Buffalo Mountain area, and the land surrounding the existing natural area preserve. But it's also going to add to the scenic preservation of a real natural landmark and increase the recreational opportunities in the area. So if Lucas, you could go to the next slide. Buffalo Mountain, as you can see, is situated just to the west of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The lighter green area is what the state already owns for the existing natural area preserve. That's about 1,000 acres. And what we're looking to buy is everything in red, which is 3,300 acres around it. The mountain itself and much of the land we're purchasing is visible at various points along a 30-mile stretch of the Blue Ridge Parkway. And local lore actually has it that children in the community were told, go out and play and come home. Don't go any farther than you can. When you lose sight of the buffalo, come home. Children were told to stay in sight of the buffalo, which, having driven now around Floyd County, you can see Buffalo Mountain all the way to North Carolina. So that's not putting a lot of limits on people, on kids, but such were the days. So as I said, this project's going to add 3,300 acres of new public land to the existing natural area preserve, and it'll more than double the amount of public land in Floyd County itself. A lot of the land that you see here in the Rocky Knob Recreation Area is actually in the neighboring Patrick County, not in Floyd County. So there's very little public land in Floyd. The property is also in the headwaters of the New River, so protection of all of the streams and critically Laurel Fork in the property is really critical for protecting the water quality for the hundreds of thousands of people who rely on the New River downstream for drinking water. and that's the cities of Blacksburg, Christiansburg, and then as you get into West Virginia, it's a lot more folks. So if you want to flip to the next slide, you know, the real opportunity to purchase this property came the way a lot of projects do. You know, the Lawson family had sold the 1,000 acres to the state back in the 90s. And the state was always like, well, we'd love to buy more if you're willing to. And the family wasn't willing to do that. There's now an impending generational shift in the land ownership. Jack Lawson, who's in this picture here, is a 51% shareholder in the family holding company for the property. And as the generational shift is taking place, as older generations die and pass their shares in the company onto other members of the family, those members of the family don't live in Floyd County anymore. They don't live anywhere as close to here, and they don't have the same connection. In fact, Jack and his cousin Lucas are really the only two members of a fairly large family who visit this property regularly. So there's been a push to sell it. And one of the proposals that was made, you see in the map, it's to parcelize the property and sell it into large lots, which would be very lucrative for the family. But Jack, like I said, still lives in the area and farms in the area and has a real personal connection here. And he wanted to see if they could make one attempt at a conservation solution before they made kind of the irrevocable decision to divide the property. So in 2020, they started thinking about selling it and made that call to the DCR director. Once DCR's director received that call, he was like, great, we really want this property. But he had to admit that while they were interested, they had no ability to figure out how to fund such a purchase. They weren't in a position to deal with the family dynamics, and certainly did not have the kind of timeline and staffing that the family would need to kind of work through this project. So Clyde gave me a call. And when we got engaged, we were able to negotiate an option to purchase the property from the family that gave us both a guaranteed purchase price, as well as a year to secure funding and exercise the option. And I'm really happy to say that as of today, working with the state, we've secured a $9.5 million federal forest legacy grant and a $3.6 million grant from the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation. That $3.6 million is the largest VLCF grant that's ever been made in the 25-year history of VLCF. That's both a testament to how important this project is, and also the efforts that have gone on to really increase the state level funding to be able to match those large forest legacy grants that we've had here in Virginia in the past. Virginia really suffers from a lack of state level funding. At the most, on an annual basis, we've had $20 million statewide for land acquisition for everything: parks, natural areas, forests, wildlife management areas, city and county-based conservation projects. So a $3.6 million grant is a massive investment in Floyd County. And we're now still working to raise the last little bit of money. We probably have a $500,000 gap until we can close the funding gap on this project. But if you go to the next slide, Lucas, we'll talk about why this is so important. So Buffalo Mountain is incredibly unique. It sits at almost 4,000 feet in elevation. And as I said, it's visible from North Carolina. You can see this mountain from quite a lot of the surrounding area. And the top of the mountain is this high elevation meadow with unique habitats for insects like the Buffalo Mountain mealybug, which you can only find on Buffalo Mountain, but also mountain sandwort, three-toothed cinquefoil, and several other really specific plants that grow just in this kind of dry, rocky environment. But the lower slopes of the mountain also contain important species, and that's what we're purchasing. These other important species are largely grass of Parnassus. There are other native grasses and abundant wildflowers that attract endangered insects like Mitchell's satyr and this eastern swallowtail that you can see in the picture. You want to go to the next slide, we'll go a little further downslope to the globally rare southern Blue Ridge Mafic woodland seeps and the southern Appalachian Rich Cove forests. These both provide different, very unique habitats for specific plant communities. The southern Appalachian Rich Cove forests especially are a dying breed. They're Rich Cove forests because that's where we grew the best timber, and a lot of those forests have been harvested. It's where the best soils are. So if people were building houses, they were putting their septics there. So this is a very intact ecosystem that we have here. All total, the land surrounding the existing preserve and subject to this project support 15 rare plants, 6 rare animals, and 9 significant natural communities. And DCR, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, has identified this property as the largest and most significant in terms of natural area preserve resilience and essential element protection in their 2022 conservation site planning for the existing natural area preserve. The property also contains habitat for federally threatened small world pogonia, a lovely wildflower, and the federally threatened bog turtle, which you see in this picture. And I really credit this picture of the bog turtle for getting us that Forest Legacy grant. Those of you not familiar with Forest Legacy, you're given 4 photographs to tell your entire story, and this was one of them. And I think it's the most charismatic animal you're going to see today. If you want to go to the next slide. The ability to open such a large property to the public is the other really exciting piece of this project. As I said, Floyd County has very little public land. And the land that there is Buffalo Mountain Natural Area Preserve. The top of the mountain has 1 parking area. It holds 10 cars, and this is the 3rd most visited natural area preserve in the entire system of over 65 sites. Given its proximity to Blacksburg and the Virginia Tech campus, it gets a lot of folks coming out from there, a lot of folks coming down from Richmond, Roanoke rather. And it's a fairly easy walk. There's only 3 miles of trails that are already at high elevation, so you can get up high pretty easily. So it really gets overrun with people. And during COVID, it actually had to be shut down at several points because there were just too many people utilizing the top of the mountain. But by expanding the land ownership further down slope, we'll be able to disperse the usage and also open up new habitats and new experiences on the property. So we're working with DCR, the county, and the Virginia General Assembly to build support for the management of much of this property as a new state park, in addition to managing parts of it as a natural area. If it does become a state park, it will possibly be the 49th state park on our way to 50 state parks by the 100th anniversary of the state park years. And while natural area preserves allow for limited day use, state park management would allow for camping and a much more broad outreach to the public. It would also allow for more economic opportunities for the community. So what you see pictured here is Laurel Fork Creek. This is currently closed to the public. There are very few access points to Laurel Fork Creek, but it is an incredible fishing resource and travels the property for more than 7 miles from start to finish. This creek contains really impressive pools that contain brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout, and really could be an amazing resource for the community once it's opened up to the public by the state. So Lucas, if you want to just go to the last slide, where to from here? Dan is not the only person who goes camping and hiking with a kitten. This was a kitten I encountered at the top of Buffalo Mountain with someone who had taken their kitten hiking with them. But we did exercise our option to purchase the property earlier this year, and we are working through the final due diligence, the survey work, the title work, et cetera, and we'll expect to close on the property in several phases over the next 1.5 years. I expect we'll own at least 400 or 500 acres by sometime in July and get that into the hands of the state by early 2025, with the entire property going to the state by the end of 2025. And hopefully then they'll be able to start really planning for state park resources and opening the rest of the property to the public. So with that, I'll look forward to questions later and hand it back over to Lucas and Dan.
Great. Thanks, Heather. And I was going to ask you when when I had seen your slides, I said, I knew that there's a lot of rare flora and fauna on Buffalo Mountain. And I was like, I didn't know there was its own wildcat or what this was at the final slide. So that's funny.
It's the rare Buffalo Mountain wildcat, yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
It had a wonderful little backpack. It was like a bubble backpack so the kitten could see out while she was hiking up the trail with it. It was really quite charming.
That's great. Awesome. Well, I will, Dan, I will pass it to you for a final presentation and get another region of the country.
Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for spending time with us. Just to remind you, I'm the Wyoming State Director for the fund, and we are now traveling to Northwest Wyoming. I want to thank Clint and Heather for their presentations. I enjoyed listening to all that, and just want to say they are 2 of the very best land conservation practitioners in the United States. So it's a treat for me too to hear their stories. It's a lot of work that goes into these projects. So I know for me, and it may be true for you as well, that listening on Zoom can be tiring. And so the way I'm going to do this, rather than going into all the nitty-gritty details of the project, is I'm going to tell you two stories, one about people and one about wildlife, and then bring those together and how they came on the project that we're talking about, which is Munger Mountain. So the first about people. And this also goes to what Heather was talking about in how do we develop these projects and where do they come from? And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and say, how did that ever happen? So the family that owns the ranch, here's the history, which is pretty fascinating. This ranch in Jackson Hole is the largest ranch, remaining intact ranch in Jackson Hole. And just to locate you, this is Northwest Wyoming. If you imagine Yellowstone National Park, directly south of that is Grand Teton National Park, and directly south of Grand Teton is the Jackson Hole Valley. It's called the Valley because it's at 6,000 feet approximately, but the Yellowstone Plateau sort of rises up to Yellowstone up to about 8,000 feet. And it's all surrounded by mountains that are somewhere between 10 and 13,000 feet high. So both the people and the wildlife were attracted to Jackson Hole because in the winter, there's, I don't know how many dozens of feet of snow in the mountains. And so both wildlife and people have wintered or spent time in the valley of Jackson Hole because it's the only really habitable place at wintertime. So here's how this ranch came together. In 1929, there was a young boy, he was 12 years old, and by the name of Stanley, and he went out to Jackson Hole with a friend and with a friend's family. And so at that time, there were about a little more than 500 people who actually lived in the Jackson Hole Valley. And before that, that's the area where there were a lot of Native American tribes. That's where the mountain men that are famous, Jim Bridger and John Coulter, and some of the original paintings of the West came from this area. So he goes out there from, his dad was an advertising executive who lived in Greenwich, Connecticut. And he visits with this family, and he goes back and he says, hey, Dad, this is awesome out here. We need to buy some land. Like, we need to have a ranch. And so sight unseen, his dad bought 400 acres, and the whole family went out there the next year and became very enthusiastic about building a ranching operation. The mom, not so much. The dad was very enthusiastic about it. And so over time, over the next approximately 10 years, they put together what is now a little more than 5,000 acres, 5,100 acres in an upper and a lower ranch that was a functional ranch. And just one little aside of that is there's a cabin there that's called the White Cabin because it's white. Most of the cabins are, dark colored wood, and they're pretty dark. And that was designed in part by the mom, who brought out the architect who actually designed the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So it's a little bit brighter and just a teeny bit less confining, but it's just a little cabin. It just happens to be painted white, and it does actually make a big difference when in there. It feels a lot lighter. So the family came out, and then there were several daughters that they've been working the ranch, and then one of those daughters had 7 sons, another had a couple of daughters. So now we're in the 4th generation, and there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 descendants, some of whom are married, some of whom have kids. There's a 5th generation, even moving on to the 6th. And so somehow, amazingly, they've been able to keep this ranch mainly intact. And ranching is a difficult business, and part of that has been changing the ranching operation, but it also has to do with non-ranch income. So for example, there may be weddings that occur, and trail rides, and hunting or scenic tours like talc tours will come by. And so one of the operating principles for this family, which is split among many, many, many people living all over the country, is that they have been conservation oriented. They've been trying to keep it intact. And if you imagine estate taxes and different desires for people who never go to Jackson Hole, who would like to have part of that land. And so today, so if there were 500 people in 1920 or 1930, there are probably 15, 20,000 people who live in the valley, and there are more than 3 million visitors every year because it is such an intact, beautiful place, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem being the largest intact temperate ecosystem in the world. And so part of a very important tool for them economically, and part of what we're looking at is both the conservation and the economic impact. That's part of our dual charter in looking at both those things. Is conservation tools have been really important, and sometimes they are compensated for some of the conservation they've done. They've done a lot of donated conservation, been tremendously generous, but as land values go up and development pressure has tremendously increased, keeping the ranch intact as property taxes go up and everything else is super duper important. So that's part of what we're doing, is we're trying to figure that out. And it's just an amazing story that this family has not succumbed to dividing up the ranch, similar to the family that Heather's working with, where there's just a tremendous amount of pressure to divide these types of properties. And so that's sort of the people that are involved in this project on the family side. So switching over to the wildlife, and let's look at the map briefly. I know these maps are super detailed, and so the next slide. So we're looking at the very southern end of the Jackson Hole Valley. So all the green you see in the lower left of that map, that's all mountainous and forests. And this is the southern end of the valley. And that sort of blue color, that's what's called the South Park Wildlife Management Area. It's managed by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. There are 1,000 elk that winter on that property that come from the surrounding forest. The way that they get there are through those arrows coming out of the forest. So part of what we've been doing is focusing on protecting those migration routes. We've done multiple conservation projects in this area, all of the red, both the red outline, the red hashed, and this most recent project is the red colored shaded properties, all of which are focused on protecting those migration routes. And they also, in the crosshatched one, it's also an elk calving area. And Jackson Hole is also the location for the National Elk Refuge, where approximately 7,500 elk this past winter were wintering in the valley. And if you go to the next photo, you can see, that's the property. We'll come back to that one. That's a beautiful one. Let's go to the elk. So those are elk on the property migrating across to the South Park Wildlife Management Area. And if you go back to the map for a second, I know I'm flipping around. I just want to say, so the development, one more back, you see the little dashed area. That property was subdivided. And so there are homes there. And in a 2015 study where they had collared many of the members of the elk herd, they found that there were 0 elk going through that area, none. So 1,000 elk are coming through, and as soon as there's a subdivision, they avoid that area. And so we're talking about like a little microcosm of importance in terms of wildlife habitat. And in this red outlined area where we've been focusing, there's about 3,000 acres of protection now, 20 or more projects that we've worked on or worked with our local partners have worked on, local land trusts. So trying to stitch together that connectivity that now with this most recent project, it's fully connected all the way through from the north-south and the east-west. So flipping ahead to a different species, next one, that's the elk out there on the property. That's a great gray owl on the nest with its little owlet. Sometimes these are called the Phantom of the North, the great gray owl. And it's the largest owl species in terms of height or length in the world. And they have very limited habitat. And what what the type of habitat that works for them. This is really one of the only places, if not the only place in Wyoming. It's the combination of forest and wet meadow and river, because they need the cover of the forest, yet they need the wet meadows for foraging and hunting. So if you are looking now, we'll go back again to the photo of the property. And if you're looking through the eyes of the Phantom of the North, you can see the cover of the forest and the wet meadows right in front of you where you go look for food. And that is a rare combination that is not subdivided with all the right elements. So all that is great, but we left our best and fun. I know this is not as big a megafauna as the tortoise that Heather mentioned, but skipping ahead to the grizzly bear. That picture is of grizzly bear 399 and her 4 cubs from a few years ago when we were starting this project. Grizzly bear 399 is the most famous grizzly bear in the world. And the reason for that is she lives mostly in Grand Teton National Park, but she is famous because she's very visible. She's often photographed. She's had more than 22 cubs. She's 27 or 28 years old now and still having cubs. And so this is her second to last litter where she had 4 cubs, which is highly unusual. Bears sometimes have 1 or 2 or 3. 4 is really, really unusual. And so just to step back for a minute about grizzly bears, in 1975, they were nearly eliminated and they were added to the endangered species list. And one of the places where they're now threatened status, which is one step down, and there are somewhere around 1,500, maybe less than that, bears in the lower 48 states. And the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is a key spot. And again, because the elevation is lower in Jackson Hole, it's heavy with grizzly bears for that reason. And so a couple of interesting things about her that make her additionally endearing to people who are following grizzly bears is not only can you see her, which is amazing, but her strategy is that she sort of stays relatively visible to humans and doesn't go as deep in the forest. And that's because male grizzly bears will often kill young grizzly bears because they want to mate with the grizzly bear mom. So at this stage, these 4 young grizzly bears who are, a couple 100 pounds, they're not small. those are year old. A male grizzly bear, a Bruin, will often try to kill those bears so that they can mate in the next season with the mother bear. So she's figured out that if I don't really bother humans and I stay out of the deep forests where the male grizzly bears might get me, like my cubs have a very high rate of survival. And there's been other things family oriented that have not been seen with other grizzly bears, but with her are true. For example, she had 3 cubs one year, and her daughter, one of her from a previous litter, adopted one of those cubs because grizzly bears, when you have 3, like any mother, you got 3 kids, that's like a lot of work versus 1 kid or 2 kids. And so grizzly bears that have a big litter often have a lower survival rate, but she's been able to survive through all of that. And so on the very day that this project was in front of the National Committee deciding on funding, this picture was taken. And we're communicating with the committee, just coincidentally, like she is out there on the property right now. This is the picture of her out there. And so that was incredible for the project, and it got funded, and all the complications, like a huge funding stack between state sources and federal sources and landowner donations and private donors were incredibly important. And so then when we were closing the project, which took several years, it was a difficult project for a lot of reasons, including valuation, she had her next litter, which is the next photo. On the left is her again in the previous year, but that is her on the right through a spotting scope with her 1 cub. And she visited the property 2 days before we closed on conserving this. Like, this is literally like bookended by her being out there. And so it's just exciting to see, that bear utilizing this territory as part of her range. And so if you think about how does this come together, and you think about a complicated family and a complicated conservation families of different wildlife species, and identifying where all that works and meeting the economic needs of the family and the wildlife needs that we're trying to accomplish in conservation and partners. And in this case, there's the United States Forest Service, the Wyoming Forestry Department, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, the what's called the Wyoming Natural Resources Trust, the local Jackson Hole Land Trust, private funders working on migration corridors and connectivity and habitat. That it takes a lot of resources to put all that together. And sure, there's funding for the projects and there's funding for match, but it's also just getting out there and visiting all those people and figuring out what their priorities are. Because what we're attuned to is the priorities of our partners, and that's both the landowners we're working with and the wildlife we're trying to protect, or the recreation corridors, or the working ranches. And so that's kind of what we do. And then the mechanisms get complicated, but we're transactionally focused and highest, I'm not going to get the terminology right, Lucas will, but highest ranking on Charity Navigator and being really efficient putting these things together. And so I hope that in some of the stories here, whether it's the Phantom of the North or Grizzly Bear 399, you have a fun story to take with you from today from Wyoming. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Dan. And thank you to all the panelists. And your final point is something I, really want to make sure everyone comes away with a great understanding of, which is that, these projects are often multi-year endeavors that are on our partners or our conservation priority lists for long periods of time. And then at a moment's notice, sometimes the property is ready to change hands, and the Conservation Fund is really uniquely suited to be able to rise to this occasion and step in quickly, buying our agency or land trust partners or other stewards time that they need to build a strategy for permanent conservation. And this is true, as Dan mentioned, for things like not just these forests, but working farms and ranches. But it's impossible to cover all of this in just a 10-minute long presentation. So we don't have a ton of time left, but I think we've got time for one or two questions from the group. And I'd say feel free to put them in the chat or sort of raise your hand, and we'd love to just open it up to all of you.
Lucas, this is Clint. I noticed that there was a question in the chat asking who the previous owner of the Pelican River Forest was. And great question. The previous owner was a timber management investment organization, which we often shorten to a TIMO. And what those are organizations or entities, whether they're individuals or investors, a consortium of investors that are looking at investing in timberland specifically. And typically what they do is they're in it for a reasonably long-term investment, somewhere in the 15 to 20-year period of time. What they typically do is they will buy the land, manage the land for a profit. At the end of the day, they're in it for profit. They're trying to return some investment to their shareholders or to the individuals that may be part of that. So technique wise, they oftentimes carve the property up. They'll retail, what we call retailing out the really juicy lots, for example, that would be good for development, or they, in order to market the property to, say, the next owner, they'll kind of start parceling it out, starting squeezing down the size to make it more affordable and more valuable to others. So that process of commercial timber ownership started a long time ago, over 150, almost 200 years ago in some places. And over time, those large ownerships have been slowly carved up. And what we get today are really just the fragments. And the project in Wisconsin was the largest remaining intact fragment, essentially, of ownership left in the state of Wisconsin. So it's been the largest conservation project in modern state history. Great question.
I see there's a question in the chat from Tim about preserving farmland, and I do want to highlight that that is another really core pillar of our Working Lands work through our Working Farms Fund, which is fairly new, but we actually just crossed the threshold of 1,000 acres of land impacted through this program. And what that's allowed us to do is not only provide up and coming or often first generation farmers from diverse backgrounds a pipeline or an access to permanent farmland ownership. So it's allowing them to build that generational wealth and support the next generation of farmers while doing things like making sure we're supporting sustainable agricultural practices and connecting those individual farmers directly to wholesalers and metropolitan areas. We're often dealing with sort of the suburbs or exurbs of large urban areas, like where this started in Atlanta. And so there's all of these wonderful components to the food system, to economic development. But I'm going to pivot to the climate side too and say, as we're more at risk of natural disasters and warming temperatures that can throw off the growing cycles, for example, having a food, part of the food system directly in your community is a wonderful buffer against that. And it also really drastically lowers the carbon footprint of, let's say you're in Pennsylvania, having food delivered from California to Pennsylvania takes a lot more carbon than if there's something directly in your backyard. Let's see. I know I will admit we've got a couple questions here in the chat. I don't think we'll be able to get to everything, but I would love to follow up with everyone offline. But thank you all. Sorry, Heather, I saw you came off mute. Do you want to answer the Virginia?
Okay. I can answer the Virginia question relatively quickly. So the state does sort of pay us back. We've basically helped them raise the funds through the Forest Legacy Grant and the VLCF grant that will pay for most of the project. So we will use our capital to purchase the property. They'll use those grants that they've secured to take us out of the project. We had about depending on how things go with expenses, we had about a $600,000 to $800,000 gap that we've partially closed in terms of funding we haven't identified for the project yet. And I think we're at about 500,000 that we're still looking to cover all the rest of our costs. The survey on 100-year-old deeds in the mountains of Virginia is ruinously expensive. So that alone is several $100,000 that we've got to find funding for. So, yeah.
Well, with that, I know we're getting close to 2 o'clock. And I just want to say again, we so appreciate you all taking the time to reflect with us this Earth Day. The challenges that are facing our climate and our planet are not slowing down by any stretch, but land conservation really is a critical piece in keeping us resilient. And it's so important that we keep scaling up our work. I'm really proud to say that our momentum is growing. 2023 was a banner year for the Conservation Fund, and we've got a really impressive pipeline of projects underway in a really diverse array of geographies and communities. And I've got 3 things to leave with you before we get you all out of here. And the first is that we just can't do this work alone. And so thank you again for being part of this journey. For those of you who are representing organizations out in the community, this was an introduction to 3 of our great expert conservationists who have a whole portfolio of projects underway, and we're eager to keep those conservation wins coming. And I know we all love to continue the conversation. And if you're an individual who's feeling inspired today, I'm excited to share that in honor of Earth Day, from now through April 23rd, all gifts that are made online will be matched, allowing you to double your impact for the climate and the planet. And I'll share information on ways to give right after this, but you can also visit our website at conservationfund.org/donate. And two is that you can always sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media, but we really want to hear directly from you on what types of conservation projects you individually or your institution are most interested in hearing about, and what you want to see more of from us. And then third, and this points to your question too, Lizanne, is I really encourage you all to visit our website to learn more about what's coming down the pike. We do, it was over 100 conservation projects last year alone, over 100,000 acres, and there's always so many things happening all over the country. As I said before, I hope every single one of you recognize that you're a valued partner in making this kind of work possible. I hope you see yourselves in the work we've discussed today and feel some pride and ownership in these conservation wins. I hope you'll join us for future gatherings like this and stay on the lookout for the Conservation Fund in the news, because there is a lot more to come. And then my actual last request is that this Earth Day, I hope you all get to just spend some time outside doing something fun and celebrating some of this land that sustains us. So thank you all for a great conversation and being here, and have a great Earth Day, and we're excited to see you soon.